everybody, recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 100 of the Movement Debrief. And tonight, folks, you can most certainly bet I'm going to keep it 100 with you. We're going to talk about a case that I went into today. What happens when you have someone who moves really well up top, but that's where they're hurting? Ooh, I'll talk to you about that. We're going to talk about overhead pressing, something Hunter Charneski can't do very well. But why is it important for you to work yourself up to doing it? I'll give you the answer. We're going to talk about missing molars and missing teeth. Does that impact movement? Is it something that you should be concerned about? Is it going to do some wild and crazy things to your airway? Will you die if you're missing teeth? Stay tuned. And last but not least, get yourself ready for some sit-up. What is the deal with sit-ups? Are they the devil that the industry has made them out to be? Is there utility for these things? I will give you answers to all of those things tonight because these have been questions that have been asked by the people. They will be answered for the people by this people right here, Fam Recognized Fam. Without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? Before I dive into the questions, let's talk about this case. So I have this woman. She has had upper back pain, chest pain, and GERD, so reflux symptoms going on for 5 months, insidious onset, is in the process of getting a cardio workup. It seems as though with blood work and all that, that's all been pretty good. Cardio, EKG had some PVCs on it, which doesn't seem to be correlating with the stuff that we would be seeing here. Has reported some upper abdominal pain. Feels like she is always bloated, were her words. And she had seen a colleague of mine over these last few months with, she's doing better, but not the way, not as good as she wants to be. She, when she first saw my colleague, she couldn't lie flat and have her arms in about 120 degrees of flexion. That was incredibly painful. Now she's able to lie flat, but the pain is always there. She can feel it with palpation. It's sort of palpation in the back, and it impacts her day to day, and it seems to get worse as the day goes on. So she has been referred to me to see if we can do something about it. I go through my assessment, and she's worked with my colleague before. All of the shoulder measures are clean. So, and it's not like a laxity clean, because I do test for that. I check and see if there's a little bit of extra joint play. In the humerus, everything seemed pretty good. There were no limitations, and I even checked some of the extra stuff that I normally check, so no issues. But what she did have was low back pain, which was something she didn't mention to me in the beginning. She also had some limitations in the lumbopelvic area. So her straight leg raise was 60 degrees bilaterally. I would hope for 90 in this case. Hip extension, when I'm using your classic Frank Ober's test, was about minus 10 degrees both sides. Hip internal rotation, normal's 40. She was sitting at about 25 on both sides. And so, I was kind of thinking initially when I was doing the testing that, oh, wow, this is kind of weird. You don't see improvements or really good motion up top too often, so I wondered what the deal was with that. But what I ended up doing was just treating what I saw. And what I saw in this woman in particular was someone who had limitations in the lumbopelvic region. Infrasternal angle, for those of you who measure that, that was fairly dynamic. And I gave her 2 moves. She had been doing some of the classic stuff that we normally do. So some 90-90, some rock back activities. If you don't know what those are, I'll link them in the show notes, which will be on zachcouples.com at some point, either today or tomorrow. Probably tomorrow because the internet has been kind of slow. But we put her with the classics, and that didn't seem to help much. So what I ended up doing was addressing those limitations that I saw. So I gave her 2 moves. I gave her a move that Bill Hartman affectionately calls, which I'll link him in the show notes. If you don't know who that is, shame on you. But Daddy-O Pops calls it the Skywalker'S. And what that would be is Basically, you're in a 90-degree angle at the hips and knees, feet are on the wall. You curl up the pelvis as far as you can, making sure the lumbar spine stays rounded and you're not getting excessive erector spinae tension. Lift one leg up in the air, so we load the hamstrings and glute max. And then I had her curl up the rest of her body to reach for her opposite foot. That was on the straight leg. And so my intent with that was to improve the hip limitations that I had seen, but also my other thing that I wanted to focus on with that was driving spinal inhalation, which what that generally is, for those of you who don't know, is I want to see the spine be able to round effectively. In terms of some testing that was painful or that stood out to me in standing was seated trunk rotation elicited pain in her upper back. And when she did a toe touch to squat, it was in more of a exhaled spine strategy to where the back was flat, despite the table tests. That's why I chose that technique. We did that, got everything to improve range of motion wise on the right side, so everything was within normal limits. She had 90-degree straight leg raise. Hip extension and adduction was full. Hip abduction, which I test once I clear full hip extension, was full. Everything was looking pretty. On the left side, she had an improvement in her straight leg raise. We were sitting at about 75. Hip IR was about 35, so it's still a little bit limited. Hip adduction, abduction were clean. So I was like, okay, we're heading in the right direction. The next move that I chose, because I still saw that there were some movement limitations in the lower extremity, i.e. the limitation in straight leg raise, I went with something to see if I could improve upon that. So I continued to basically focus on her tucking capabilities. We used a move that I like to affectionately call the Drunken Turtle, which what that is basically is I have someone grab their knees to their chest, they roll back and forth as much as possible, getting as much rounding through the spine as possible. So we did that, and after we did that, straight leg raise was clean. She had full hip IR, everything was looking hunky-dory on the table. Had her sit up, check the trunk rotation, no pain. Well, actually, I lied. There was a little bit of pain at the end, but the range of motion was full. Had her stand up. She had some pain with side bends and rotation and backward bend. Backward bend was pain-free, much more motion. And then the side bends were good to the right, not so great to the left. That's where I was at this point in the game. I was pretty happy, but I would like to get this woman even more happy because she's been struggle bus for 5 months now. So I did one other thing. I did a manual counter nutation technique. For crying out loud, keep it PG, folks. What I did was I brought the knees to the chest, made sure that her hips were able to tilt upward, and I had her in that position just push against my hands. And what that serves to do is it recruits the glute max in a stretched position to hopefully create some degree of counter nutation. That's at least my thought process by doing that. Once we did that, I had her stand up again, check the side bend, absolutely no pain. Had her do the seated trunk rotation, was able to go even further with just a minor amount of pain. And then when she touched her chest, which was painful to palpation, completely pain-free. And I thought this was a huge win for her. Now, I will be curious to see how she does when I see her next week. We will stay tuned. Maybe I'll give you a little update on that. But the point by me emphasizing this case in particular is even when you see some wild and crazy things, you still have to ensure that you treat the entire person and all of their movement limitations. So in a case like this individual, everything was great up top. So what was there to treat? Was there some local issues? Did we have to go with something fancy up in the cranial-cervical region? Or did we just need to redouble our efforts on the basics and focus on improving range of motion in the area that she was limited? And I went with the latter route, and by us doing that, she seemed to get some improvements both in her thoracic pain as well as her lower back pain. And I didn't even charge her extra for that part. So I emphasize that case by making sure that even when you see some things wild and crazy, continue to treat the individual who you're working with as you would anything else. And if you've done all those things, you've exhausted all those options, then that's probably when you should go explore some other avenues. Now, that being said, I want to do my due diligence for this woman because she did mention some gut stuff. So the next time I see her, I told her to bring in some lab work. And just, I'm not a functional medicine expert by any means, but I've taken some seminars. I've gone through the functional medicine protocol myself, and I'm just going to look at the lab values to see if there's anything out there that jumps out based on some of the information that I've acquired from taking some seminars. And it may be as simple as referring her to a functional medicine practitioner to see if that clears up some of this GERD stuff or some of the bloating that she has. But that was my thought process to cover the possible things that could be contributing to this woman's symptoms. So please, this has been my thing with Human Matrix, but I think we do not emphasize the fundamentals and the basics enough. And I gave this woman right here a basic approach, more basic than Starbucks and Uggs, if you know what I'm sizzling. And it seemed to work really well. So I encourage you to continue to hammer your basics, and I bet more often than not, you peeps are going to be in business. So there's that. Now, after we've got done talking about that, let's move on to the first question. And this question comes from Paul. Here's what Paul asks me. Question for debrief, question mark. You recently mentioned shoulder press, overhead press, as a good movement to aim for. As I think you insinuated, it ticks all the breathing boxes. Do you prefer bar in front of the neck or behind it in terms of best position for the lumbar region? Paul, this is a great question. Why do I think the overhead press is the cat's pajamas? Paul's right. I think that if you can do it correctly, it is the best expression of multidirectional expansion in the rib cage. So you have to be able to have the lower thorax anchored so you can get expansion, both pump handle, front of the chest, and posterior thorax, back expansion to allow for the arm to go overhead. The reason why you need expansion both front and back for the overhead press is, one, it has to do with scapulohumeral rhythm. So I got a scapula right here. If the medial border of the scapula is glued to the rib cage because of concentric orientation of stuff back there, predominantly the rhomboids, I have to be able to eccentrically orient that stuff to allow the scapula to move away from the spine. So there has to be some degree of eccentric orientation in the posterior aspect of the rib cage to allow the scapula to go into upward rotation, which is necessary for the overhead position. Now, that being said, you are going to have some tension of stuff on the backside since all the muscles that contribute to scapular upward rotation, aside from the serratus anterior, are on the posterior aspect. So you got mid-lower trap. There has to be some degree of contraction of those tissues. And you do have serratus anterior, which would be squishing on the side. But the stuff higher up, which might be your upper trap and rhomboids, ought to be eccentrically oriented. That's where you get your posterior expansion, which allows this thing to go upward. When I am pressing the weight overhead, I have to be able to externally rotate the humerus, especially at the top end of that thing, because that allows for the humeral head to clear the top of the shoulder blade, and when that happens, you're able to fully go overhead. So most of the muscles, the big muscles that internally rotate the humerus, are on the front side of the chest, which would be your pectoralis major. If you can't eccentrically orient that, that's going to limit your overhead capabilities. Therefore, you need to be able to have some degree of anterior expansion to complete the lift. So, you could argue one of two things with that. One, being able to complete an overhead press is a great way to demonstrate the ability to create that multidirectional expansion in the thorax, or it could be a useful tactic, or building up to that could be a useful tactic for creating that multidirectional expansion in thorax. So how do you get someone, then, to build up into an overhead press? Well, I'm glad you asked. Most people, let's talk about this from the worst case scenario, movement-wise, or in breathing-wise in the thorax. If I have someone who cannot get air anterior to posterior in the upper thorax, I need to do things that create simultaneous expansion of that region. And what I've found useful, and I have to again give a lot of credit to Bill on this, is utilizing inversion-based activities to create that A to P expansion. So if you could envision the ventral cavity, which is the thorax, abdomen, and pelvis, as my hydro flask, brought to you by Hydro Flask. If they want to give me money, please do. If the hydro flask was smaller in the top part of this, and it was subsequently larger on the bottom part, that would be someone who is concentric or 10-step, or who cannot get expansion in the upper component of the hydro flask or upper thorax, and then they might be more eccentrically oriented or stretched in the lower portion of the ventral cavity, so the abdomen and pelvis region. An easy way to flip-flop that relationship would be to invert or tip upside down this water bottle, because now the stuff in the ventral cavity is moving towards the upper component of my body, and especially if I can create some contractions in this position, I can squeeze the stuff, your viscera and your air, from the bottom up to allow the top part of the thorax to expand. And that's why inversion can be quite useful, because you're taking advantage of gravity to alter that relationship between the top part of the ventral cavity and the bottom part of the ventral cavity. So, from a fitness perspective, if I have someone who can't overhead press, what's a good starting place for someone? I absolutely love all types of decline pressing because it fits that same mold. So if you have a scenario where the hips are higher than the thorax, you can facilitate that A to P expansion in the easiest position. So you could use decline bench. I program that a lot for my people. You could just have them do a bridge of some sort, either in the 90-90 or hook line position, so the hips are higher than the thorax. Have them do some pressing of various kinds. You can have them do one arm or alternating. That's usually what I go with. That's a great starting point. From there, once you've had them do decline for however much time, and a way you can check that is just you could use your overhead press as your retest, or you could have them just do basic shoulder flexion. But once they've gotten that down pat, you can start incorporating some incline-based pressing. And all I do is really I start from a very low incline and I just continue to notch up until I get to a point where they're darn near overhead, which would be your overhead press position, or your Arnold press position, actually. And I find for many people, Arnold presses are a great thing to get to that you need to be able to do in order to overhead press effectively. And the reason why is because I think the seated position allows you to much better or more effectively stack the pelvis and thorax or in the thoracic diaphragm atop of one another to allow for that A to P expansion in the upper thorax to occur, because you can rock back on your hips, you can keep your back a little bit more flexed, and the seated position has been shown to improve bucket handle movement of the lower thorax, and I'll link the Takashima article that talks about that. So, seated position is good. From there, if I want to work with a 2-arm overhead press because gains, I usually will start someone with a 1-arm, then progress to alternating, and then eventually go to double press. Once they can do that with an Arnold press, then it's about progressing them to standing stuff, utilizing the same progression that I enlisted. And in terms of durations, this is likely going to be idiosyncratic. Some people might be able to progress to that pretty quickly, others not so much. But to me, if you start with decline and then slowly build up the incline, working the Arnold press for a hot minute, then getting to overhead press, you're most likely going to be in business and get more of your people overhead pressing effectively. Now, in terms of the component of the question that Paul asked in terms of going front of the neck or behind it, I usually go in front of the neck. I find that for most people, and this is another reason why I don't really back squat much, but most people who have to get the bar behind the neck in that position, it can require extreme ranges of motion at the glenohumeral joint, which for most people is not that useful. Also, it becomes much harder to stack in that position because when you put the bar behind your back, you're more likely to be arched, which will make it really, really tough for you to stack the thorax and pelvis atop one another, which creates the base to allow for anterior to posterior expansion of the upper thorax to occur, which, as I stated previously, is necessary for an overhead press. So, that being said, to me, going with a front rack is a much more useful way of employing the overhead press. And that's usually what I stick with for most of my clientele. So to summarize your great question, Paul, overhead pressing, super important because it allows for multi-directional expansion of the rib cage. The way I program this is I start with decline, work to an incline, and slowly inch my way up until we are going overhead in a seated position, progress it to standing, and keep it in front of you, and then keep the gain train going. Great question, Paul. Now, if you are like, well, that's really good, Zach, and I think I could probably employ that, but I'm not so sure I can coach the overhead press effectively, or maybe you have a troubled client who you've tried that with, and you might have to dig a little bit deeper into some specific limitations that they have, and you're like, well, maybe there's a little bit more to this, or maybe you're just like, wow, Zach was talking about all these wild and crazy rib cage mechanics, and I'm just not familiar with that, but I think it could be important for my people. Where in the heck could I learn more about this stuff? Well, I got an answer for you, and that answer is Human Matrix, Jesus, Human Matrix, my seminal seminar. And it's coming your way in many locations. I'll tell you where I'm going to be. November 23rd and 24th in New York City. The early bird ends this month, i.e. next week, actually, so you better definitely sign up for that. It's selling like hotcakes, folks. December 7th and 8th in Orlando, Florida. There are some CEUs available for that one if you are a personal trainer, NSCA or NASM, or an ATC. Actually, we even got nursing ones. So, Kyle, I'm looking at you. So stay tuned for that. January 25th and 26th in Scotts Valley, California, which is just outside the San Francisco Bay Area. April 4th and 5th in Atlanta, Georgia, where the players play. And then, of course, myself, Pat Davidson, and Seth Oberst will be doing round 2, The Uprising, where we challenge some conventional wisdom that happens in our industry. It's going to be in Boston, Massachusetts on February 8th and 9th. The early bird for that ends January 3rd. I hope to see you at one of them or maybe all of them. Maybe you want to get on the road and see how it changes from place to place. Awesome. The next question comes from 2 people. We have Pit Bulls and Push-Ups. That's a dope name. And Sayun, which I hope I pronounced that correctly. So let me read both of their questions together. So Pit Bulls goes, "Hi, doctor. Hi, client. Love your work. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. Do you have a podcast about missing a molar? I'm curious if missing a molar can affect how much weight you can move by causing instability on that same side." And then Sayun, this person's portion is another question. "Do you have any tips for patients who have teeth removal for braces? For example, I've had 2 of my premolars removed, one up top, one down low, and I find it hard to gain control of my craniocervical and mandibular motions. It feels extremely narrow and restricted, causing a variety of problems. Thank you once again, Big Dog." All right, this is a tough question. I've been putting this off for a very long time because I've had these 2 questions sitting in queue, and the reason why is because I think that this area is a little bit of a dicey topic. So I'm going to kind of hit this with 2 pieces. So let's talk about Pit Bull's component first, which he's talking about if this is going to impact how much weight you can move, and also Sayun is talking about some symptoms here. So let's talk about first if missing molars is going to negatively impact your motion. So why are molars there aside from chewing? They do give us some degree of sensory awareness where our jaw is in space. And a lot of times if you lack a place to contact, that might change the position that you gravitate to in your jaw, which may have some negative implications from a movement standpoint. But practically, where I work, I have quite a few people who have missing teeth. In most of the rural places that I have worked, I mean, people lose teeth, and in a variety of ways, and it happens. And what makes it tough for the crowd that I work with is I can't necessarily refer these people to a dentist to get that fixed. So we have to make do. And after spending a few years making do with this population, even if you are missing teeth, do not underestimate how well the body can compensate for these losses of bone. I mean, there are people who have amputations in legs and can still move really well and do lots of really cool things, can run really fast and all types of stuff. And the teeth and the molars missing, which molars are bone, or teeth are bone, that should be no different in this case. I find that many people who maybe try to go down routes to fix this, thinking that that's going to fix their movement problem, really are missing it on the basics. So ask yourself before you go chasing this path, do I have all the basics down pat? Can you touch your toes? Do you have a full squat that looks pretty? Are you able to stack? Can you overhead press? Those would be things that I would focus on first and foremost before you go into fixing a potential missing molar. And I would even say, before going to that point, if you have, ask yourself if you've done myofunctional therapy, because I also think that that is an incredibly underutilized discipline that can be quite impactful for people. This is me just maximizing your conservative measures to make sure you get successful outcomes. So you can do a lot of cool things to address the structure of the jaw, but if you lack an inability to control the musculature or the dynamics within that region, which would be myofunctional therapy with your tongue, because that can most certainly influence the structure of the airway, especially in children, as well as your ability to move the jaw. If you don't have the supportive musculature to make things worthwhile, I don't think it's going to be that impactful to necessarily get a thing to fix the missing molar. So I can't emphasize this enough, that you need to make sure you have the basics in place first, because you may go and do something with a dentist with the intent of improving your movement capabilities, and it might not be as effective as you thought it would be, because you have had a loss of, because you don't have the fundamentals in place. Now, that being said, can having altered contact on your teeth impact force production? There are some interesting studies out there which say possibly. There is one where they, I will definitely link this in the show notes, but I'm going to have to pull it off, where they had people have mouth guards. I believe the mouth guard was offset, or it altered their occlusion in a manner that's more symmetrical and favorable. And that positive, in that case, positively influenced the amount of hamstring force production that was able to undergo with that person. And when they had a malocclusion where they were only contacting on one side, that negatively impacted hamstring force production. And there's a few other studies out there that have things like this, where if we change the contact of the teeth, that can impact things in other areas. A common thing you'd want to look up is the H reflex, hamstrings and occlusion. But they've done some research out there showing where you alter occlusion, and that changes the contractile tension within the gastroc. So there is definitely a global or a systemic impact that can happen by alterations up in the cranial cervical region. At least that's how I take it. So there can definitely be some individuals who need to go this route. But I would say, practically, most people don't. An overwhelming majority of people don't. And I've had people the last 3 years, or 2 years, no, 3 years. 3 years where I haven't had to send a single person to a dentist, and we've gotten favorable outcomes from most people. And I haven't had one person where I thought, this person definitely needs to go down this route. So, like I said, make sure you have the fundamentals in place before you start getting too wild and crazy with this stuff. Now, obviously, if cosmetics is the reason why you're getting it, then by all means, we need to go this route. All that being said, I definitely think the portions of Seyun's question are interesting. So Seyun had mentioned that she had some of her teeth removed, or his teeth, sorry, I don't know if you're male or female, I forget, that this person has had their teeth removed, and that's leading to some symptoms, feeling narrowness and restrictedness. So the thought, or at least the old thought was with bracing, was we were just caring about the cosmetic aspect of the teeth. And some individuals may have had a mouth that is too small. And so what do? They got rid of teeth, so they had enough teeth to make for a pretty smile and fit the structure of the mouth. I think, and not just me, but many other dentists who I respect, think this is completely bass-backwards. Is it that the mouth was too small, or that there was too many teeth? But what really the problem was is probably the mouth and the structures of the mouth and the upper airway, for that matter, was underdeveloped. And that's the reason why there was crowding in the mouth. And even though they fixed the crowding, they likely didn't fix the underlying issue, which was a underdevelopment of the craniocervical structures, which could, for some people, negatively impact the upper airway to a point where we can have things like sleep apnea, we can have upper airway resistance syndrome. And I think, to me, those are two things that are much more important to address than a movement limitation that is potentially caused by an upper airway restriction. So if this person is having some symptoms and they've tried some of the stuff that we've talked about, is probably worthwhile getting yourself checked out by a dentist who does some things with upper airway management and sleep. And in terms of the treatments that could be done, there could be a lot of different things. There could be things that drive expansion of the palate and the mouth and the midface in multiple directions in order to make more space for the airway. This could potentially have some really good impact on your symptoms. You might also want to consider looking at an ENT, because an ENT may be able to find some restrictions up in the nasal airway, as well as if you have something like a tongue tie, although some dentists can also perform the tongue tie surgery like I had. Those would be things I would definitely consider, especially if you're having headaches and ear infections. So I say all the stuff that I say about the basics, and that's still important, but Seyun, you may want to get more of a workup to see if you have some sleep issues or if you have some other issues that might be predisposing you to some of the symptoms that you have. And if you want to know what to look for when it comes to a dentist, I will link my debrief on that, because I talked about that in a few debriefs ago. So to summarize, yes, missing teeth definitely can impact movement, but not in all. We are great compensators. Make sure you have the fundamentals in place to maximize your ability to move in multiple directions. If you don't have that, even fixing stuff up top is probably not going to have the impacts that you would like movement-wise. Do that first. That being said, and that would include myofunctional therapy. If you are having some symptoms up here, headaches, ear infections, trouble sleeping, all of this, you probably want to get that looked at by a dentist or ENT or both, because they might be able to diagnose you with some upper airway issues. That could be upper airway resistance syndrome or sleep apnea. That could contribute to your symptoms, and there's lots of interventions that you can do for that that could possibly positively impact what you're talking about. So, pit bulls and push-ups, Seyun, awesome question. The last question comes from the man, the myth, the legend, Dave. a.k.a. Bay Rasco, because he my boo. Debrief question. Are sit-ups okay for abs, or will they mess up your spine shit? And I had to alter some words because Dave likes to drop F-bombs. I'm not in the mood for dropping an F-bomb for episode 100. So, sit-ups. Man, we haven't heard about sit-ups in a hot minute. And I couldn't tell you the last time that I had utilized sit-ups. And I have to give credit to a conversation that I had with Bill Hartman, Daddy O-Pops, where I forget what we were even talking about, but somehow we got onto sit-ups. And he had been playing with sit-up variations with some people. And I'm like, well, that's interesting. And I kind of thought about it. It's like you hear a lot of different things about why sit-ups phased out, and I kind of wondered, well, why did these things phase out? And I decided to do a little bit of research on why sit-ups phased out. So first off, let's look at what Dave asked. Are these bad for your back, sit-ups? Is that the reason why sit-ups have fallen out of favor in the fitness industry? Instead of sit-ups, we're doing more planks and things of those nature. And I remember that one of the big things that I think probably killed sit-ups is the military phasing sit-ups out of their testing. And so I looked into why this was the case. If you look at some of the stuff on the internets, they will say that because there were a lot of people getting injured with some of the testing. But when you deep dive into this, from a military perspective, they actually changed the testing that they were doing because the physical fitness tests that they were performing didn't necessarily transfer to what was being simulated on the battlefield. It wasn't because sit-ups were causing injuries. What's likely causing injuries is a mismanagement of load, doing too much too soon. So let's look at what the tests are that they're doing. What they were initially was sit-ups, push-ups, and a 2-mile run. This, and I'll link this article, this has been, as they say in here, the standard yardstick for a military person since 1980. And then they changed it. And if you look at sit-ups, push-ups, and a 2-mile run, I don't know to what extent those things, aside from the 2-mile run, would transfer to combat. Now contrast that with what they're actually doing now, testing-wise, in the Army. Here's what they got. They have a strength deadlift, and it looks like the trap bar. Weight range 120 to 420 pounds. Its thought was to replicate picking up ammunition boxes, supplies, or a wounded comrade. Makes sense to me. Next thing, standing power throw. Tossing a 10-pound ball backward or overhead, and overhead tests explosive muscle power needed to scale barriers or move rapidly across an uneven terrain. 3, hand release push-ups. So push up, let go, push away. Just another test to assess upper body muscles. Sprint, drag, carry. This test, soldiers run down and back a 25-meter lane 5 times. Along the way, they either sprint, drag a 90-pound sled, or carry 2 40-pound kettlebell weights, pulling someone out of harm's way or moving or carrying supplies to a fighting position. Seems like a good test. Leg tuck. Similar to a pull-up hanging from a bar, the soldier lifts both legs to touch their knees, their thighs, their elbows to strengthen the core muscles. So you're hanging knee to chest. Sure, whatever. 2-mile run, that was the only thing that stayed. When I look at the tests that they have now in comparison to what they had before, it seems to me that these tests that are done in the military have a much greater degree of transferability to what is actually being performed in combat, more so than a push-up, sit-up, and a 2-mile run alone. So it doesn't seem as though the reason why sit-ups were phased out of the military is because of injury. So if that's not the case, what led to this being a thing? And I looked up, I did some research. I tried to do the whole PubMed search thing. Nothing came up. And so I looked at a couple other articles. So I like absolutely nothing. Nothing coming up that showed sit-ups and injury and pain. It wasn't like a study came up that showed that sit-ups did not cause injury to the lower back. It's just there was nothing out there. So I'm wondering, where in the heck are people getting this stuff? And I saw an article. This was in Harvard Health. And the article is, and I'll link it in the show notes, want a stronger core? Skip the sit-ups. And this article is most certainly less than 300 words. It's super short. And here's what they say. One reason that sit-ups are hard on your back is they push your curved spine against the floor and work your hip flexors, the muscles that run from the thighs to the lumbar vertebrae in the lower back. When the hip flexors are too strong or too tight, they tug on the lower spine, which can create low back discomfort. Looks like an open and shut case, Johnson. But guess what citation they used? Absolutely none. There is no citation in this that shows back pain correlating with sit-ups, or if sit-ups causing back pain. Or how about this? Do sit-ups increase the strength and tightness of the hip flexors? I am of the belief that there's probably no bad muscles in the body. There's probably just alterations in tension that limits motion, and that can potentially create ischemia in certain areas, or it reduces movement options available. But I think that this is kind of BS. And this article that I'm going to cite from harvard.edu is the one that is cited in many of the pop things that you'll read on the internet. Now, I have come across some research where they did EMG comparisons of sit-ups working the abs and the hip flexors versus things like an ab rollout or a Swiss ball pike. And you can definitely get greater EMG activation in those areas when we're talking abdominal muscles compared to sit-ups. But what that doesn't say is that sit-ups are going to be deleterious for your lower back. Period. So perhaps sit-ups aren't as bad as we thought they were, because I haven't seen a lick of evidence that would say otherwise. And please, if you have something, send it to me, because I'm willing to be wrong on this. So, why might you program sit-ups? I've played around with some different variations. If you can have someone who can perform a sit-up effectively, what an effective sit-up is for me is, does that individual have the capability of creating roundedness through their entire spine, i.e., as I would call that, and my contemporaries and colleagues, spinal inhalation. That's, to me, all that a sit-up is. A sit-up is a toe touch. So we don't think that going down to touch your toes is bad. Why would a sit-up be bad? So if you are trying to get someone to drive spinal inhalation, or how about this, if you don't know what that is, if you got someone who can't reverse their lumbar curve, this could potentially be a good move. Some of the variations I like, though, and what I've been finding, is I don't necessarily do as many strict sit-ups as I used to. I played around with them for a while, but what I found is most people can't create that spinal inhalation, that roundedness in the lower back. What I do find useful, though, is the converse of that, which would be reverse crunching or rolling variations. I think those are incredibly good exercises because it can help with the inversion-based stuff that we discussed with the overhead press progression, and it obviously works the abs. And it, to me, a bottom-up approach seems to get people to create a better curve reversal in the lumbar spine than if we did a top-down approach. So things like reverse crunches, some of these knee-to-chest exercises that they're using in the military. I like dragon flags and dragon rolls, which I'll link the dragon roll in the show notes. But like the thing that Bruce Lee used to do, or if you watched Rocky IV, Rocky did the dragon flag. Like, those are great moves, in my opinion, to drive spinal inhalation mechanics, and they're more sit-up-y in origin than they are some of the ab exercises that we employ nowadays. So I think those are incredibly useful, and that's most of the ab work that I do for myself and a lot of what I program for the people who I work with. So reverse crunches, Also, another great technique. Bicycles, those are super good. Doing any type of dead bug variation, that's kind of crunch-like in my opinion, but I found all of these things to be quite useful for driving favorable movement changes in the body. And it doesn't seem as though the risks that we thought were there for sit-ups for the longest time are present, or at least it hasn't been researched. And from what I found employing some of these concepts with my clients, I just don't think the risk is there. Now, if your goal is hypertrophy of abdominal tissues, it might not be your best bet. I think there's probably better exercises out there. Ab wheel rollouts, have super high EMG, pikes, anything of those nature, I think are way better at getting ab hypertrophy based on some of the EMG research. I don't know to what extent planks might be good, because from talking with Ben House, he's my guy if we're talking hypertrophy, it doesn't seem as though isometrics are useful from a hypertrophy standpoint. You need to either create mechanical tension or you need to induce metabolic stress. And you don't have that much alteration in tension in the muscles if you're not doing a full concentric eccentric. So to me, planks and things of those nature, while they are useful exercises for other reasons, they might not be so great for hypertrophy of the abdominal tissues. And I would probably argue sit-ups probably aren't either in comparison to other exercises. But they could be a great activity for some to improve movement options. So to summarize, your great question, Dave. Sit-ups are not going to kill you. There is no research that supports sit-ups leading to back pain. The reason why the Army phased them out is because they found better tests to replicate what's going on in combat. What do I think is useful? I think you could potentially use good old-fashioned sit-ups. It's just really hard to get people to do that right because it requires a great degree of spinal inhalation. To me, I like to start from the bottom like your favorite Drake song and work my way up. So I like reverse crunches, reverse sit-ups, dragon flags, those types of things are incredibly useful. Sit-up variations, not that great probably for hypertrophy. I think there's better stuff out there. Dave, awesome question, and I think that's a good stopping point for us tonight. I want to thank all of you for tuning in, and IG, holy cow, y'all are showing up to hear this, so I think we're going to keep it with that Instagram, baby, live every Wednesday, or just about every Wednesday. The support, y'all have been amazing. I can't believe I've already done 100 of these. So thank you, seriously, thank you for pushing me to continue to do these things. And can't stop, won't stop, Bell House Fitness. I'm gonna keep doing what I do, which that's you drew it, isn't it? Yeah, what's good, my man. I'm gonna try not to, man. I'm gonna try to keep this thing going as long as I possibly can, unless I win the lotto. In that case, well, I'll see y'all later. But I don't play, so your odds are good. If you want to learn more and you want to support me so I can do another 100 of these or maybe 300, I don't know. I'll hopefully do this for a minute. There's a few things you can do. First, go to zachcouples.com and subscribe to my newsletter. While you're there, you're going to get tons of good stuff. You'll get about 5 hours of talks. You'll get a free course that outlines some of the basic components that might help enhance your understanding to this debrief and others, as well as the other content I have. You're going to get a free acute to chronic workload calculator so you can intelligently progress your volume of training. You'll also get weekend goodies from me every Friday. I scour the internet, find the good stuff, see what you need to check out, and go from there. So definitely check that out. I also offer 3 services. If you want to get to overhead press, but you'd like a little bit more guidance on how to do that, one thing we can do is a movement consultation, where I take a look at your movement capabilities and I find out where you can't move and what the rate limiting step is to getting you your gains. And we would do activities to improve your movement capabilities, and that could allow you to get back to pressing overhead without issues or without pain. And guess what? If you're a trainer and you're struggling with that client getting them to go overhead and they want to do that, I can help you out. We'll tag team and see if we can make good things happen for them. Or if you want to have that fit into a fitness program, but you also want to do other things that complement your movement capabilities as well as enhanced fitness, I can write a training program for you based off of what I found on a movement consultation. And we do 4 to 6 week blocks depending on what we find. And I will take what your movement capabilities are and tailor a fitness program that meets your fitness needs. Or maybe you're a coach or a clinician and you want to learn how to do this stuff with your peeps. That's where the mentorship program comes in. What we'll do is I will look at your situation. We'll have some good back and forth dialogue about how to implement some of the things that I've talked about with your specific population. And it's not me spoon feeding you. It's us working together to see if we can find some answers, whether it's a deficit in knowledge, whether it's a deficit in application, or whether it's me coaching you through some stuff or you coaching me through some stuff to see if we can get some improvements. Whatever it takes, we will help you employ some of this stuff so your clients get better results, whether it's pain getting better or whether it's performance going to the highest level. Or maybe you're good with this stuff, but you just are having some hard time organizing. I've also helped people with that in the past. I'm kind of been an organization nut, especially the last a couple months even. So I can definitely help you out with that as well. Once you've scoured ZachCouples.com, you can also find me on Apple Podcasts as well as Stitcher, and that's at the Zach Couples Show. Because guess what, folks? There are 99 other debriefs, and you might not want to look at me for all of them, or maybe you want to listen to me on a long car ride or something, or maybe you got to commute, and gosh, who better to be stuck in a car with than Big Z? Definitely sign up for me on iTunes and Stitcher, or Apple Podcasts. Now, I think they quit iTunes. And while you're there, please leave a review so the fam can keep growing. Social media-wise, I am on Facebook /ZCouples. I'm on that Instagram, baby, at Zach, ZAC Couples, CUPPLES. Twitter handle is at ZCouples. And if you want to see the most up-to-date stuff that I am employing with my clientele, my supreme clientele, go to YouTube, search Zach Couples. I'm putting up a gang of exercises all the time. The debrief will be on there in HD, 4K, all that stuff tomorrow. So definitely check that out. Thank you all again so much for your support and for tuning in. Keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving, and I'll see you next time. Deuces.